All right, so we're going to begin our discussion on the lymphatic and digestive systems, and as part of that, we will be talking about the immune system and a little bit of information on nutrition. So our first component here, we'll be talking about the lymphatic system. A lot of people commonly think of the lymphatic system and the immune system as the same thing, and in reality, they kind of are in a way. I would argue that our immune system really does hang out in the lymphatic system, within the lymphatic organs and lymphatic vessels, especially our B cells and our T cells. But there also is a little bit of linkage there with the skeletal system, because remember hematopoiesis, the creation of blood cells, all of that really starts in the bone, okay? And immature cells are made in the bone, but you'll see later on why we have some specific organs that are really crossing some boundaries and really kind of belong to multiple systems. You know, bone marrow technically is a primary lymphatic organ, even though it's inside of bone. And the spleen plays a very important role in the lymphatic and immune function of our body. But when we talk about the lymphatic system and we get away from the specifics of what the cells within the lymphatic system do, it ties into the circulatory system, because as fluid reaches the capillaries, it sort of leaks out. If you remember, the capillaries are what's called fenestrated, which means they have kind of little holes in them that allows both fluid and cells and various other molecules that are necessary for really the whole body's function. It allows these things to leak out. And with that comes plasma and other, components of blood. And those things, they leave the capillary and they end up in the interstitial space, which remember is the area that surrounds all of the cells of the body. The lymphatic system is kind of the way that we collect all of the leaked fluid and return it back to the heart. Okay, so that's kind of that extra function, and it's also why the lymphatic system is the perfect location for our immune cells to really hang out in, because it's very slow moving. It comes back from tissues. There's all kinds of stuff. We have little lymph nodes, and lymph nodes are you can really think of them as kind of like a hangout spot for cells in the lymphatic system, and they can kind of be really thought of as checkpoints where stuff flows through there, and if a cell gets triggered by it and says, oh, you shouldn't be here, that triggers an immune response. And that's why lymph nodes will swell when we are sick, because there was some sort of antigen that triggered an immune response that is in that lymph node or that chain of lymph nodes. And we have lymphedema that occurs, where a generalized inflammatory process happens where cells, the immune cells, white blood cells, they release these factors that say, other white blood cells, I need help, come help me. And this also, as part of the process, it brings fluid, it brings other cells, it brings, when necessary, if there's tissue damage, it brings along cells like fibroblasts and macrophages to start to begin the remodeling process from the damaged tissue. So really, there's so much overlap here between the lymphatic system, the circulatory system, the skeletal system, and there's even some funky stuff that we won't go much into, but the nervous system plays a poorly understood but a strong role in lymphatic cell function. Our neurons have actually been shown to directly communicate with immune cells in certain circumstances, especially if the immune cell is within the nervous system itself, like in the brain, where we have dendritic cells and kind of our modified immune cells that exist within the brain. So what you'll see on the screen now is kind of a diagram of the lymphatic system. So big concept to think about: the right side of our body, as well as most of our head, really drains through the right side of the lymphatic system. The rest of our body, to include part of the neck, the left arm, the abdomen, and both lower extremities, primarily comes up through the left side. You'll see that when you're looking at lymphatic vessels, they actually kind of follow all of our blood vessels. And remember, that makes a lot of sense because they need to be next to capillaries so that when plasma and other substances leak out, they can find a way back to the circulatory system via the lymphatic vessels. These vessels are somewhat similar to veins. They have a valve system in place. They're one-way valves. And just like the venous system, they get pushed, the fluid gets pushed back via stuff like movement. So it's the muscular pump, so to speak, similar to veins. So when we're looking at our return of lymphatics, there's a couple big things to think about. We have a right lymphatic duct and a left lymphatic duct. And there's a thoracic duct. So there's kind of three big components there. The thoracic duct really drains the entire lower body and a majority of the abdomen, okay? But all of these big ducts, they dump back into the heart, either via another vein or, in the case of the thoracic duct, directly into the aorta. It's very important that these things sort of follow the venous structure, and knowing that they have certain drainage patterns can also help predict the spread of certain diseases or cancer. You know, something like lymphoma will spread via lymphatic systems because it's a cancer of the lymph cells. Something like breast cancer can spread via the lymphatic chains. So infections can spread via nearby lymphatic chains. And I keep saying lymphatic chains because we typically have lymph nodes that are directly connected to each other and very close together. For instance, we have a set that everyone probably knows about that runs under the jaw on both sides. There's 3 to 4 subsets even that's part of that. You know, you have like the mandibular chain of lymph nodes. We also have an anterior cervical chain, which runs right across your sternocleidomastoid on the anterior side. And guess what? There's a posterior chain, which follows the posterior aspect of the sternocleidomastoid. And you normally can't feel lymphatic or lymph nodes unless they're swollen. And it is possible for them to calcify. A lot of people tend to have the lymph nodes near the tonsillar area, so the angle of your mandible. It's not uncommon for them to be calcified, which is not a problem. And that can also happen with age. And some conditions do cause it, though, so it's important to watch out for, especially when we're talking about calcification of lymph nodes in the thorax and the mediastinum. You know, that's a big key for conditions like sarcoidosis. So, as these things, as the lymph fluid gets pushed back, it ends up back into the circulation, and the process kind of starts all over again. So, moving on to the immune function. This is, you know, what a lot of time is going to be spent on when we talk about the lymphatics. But there's kind of 3 ways to think about our immune system, 3 different layers. So we have a barrier layer. These are really, when you think about it, tissues that exist to be barriers. And what are barrier tissues in our body? Well, it's a lot of our epithelial tissue, right? It's our integumentary system. It is incredibly important as a barrier defense. The mucous membranes that line our mouth, our genitourinary tracts, our digestive system, those are barrier defenses, and they have certain functions to them that help with that defense characteristic. Like our skin, it secretes sebum. Sebum is slightly acidic, and a lot of bacteria can't handle a lot of sebum. There are certain bacteria, like those associated with acne, that absolutely love it, and they'll literally live inside of your sebaceous gland, cause that to become infected, and suddenly you end up with, the pathogenic form of acne, which can be very debilitating and leave scars, as we talked about in the integumentary system lecture. Following that, though, we have kind of our cell-mounted defenses. So it's either products of cells or the cells themselves, and there is a rapid response, but this rapid response is going to be non-specific. Typically associated with that are basic leukocytes like the neutrophil, right? Our main primary responder to any real insult in the body is the neutrophil. It has so many different functions. The neutrophil is relatively non-specific. It's equipped with the capability to handle a lot of different things, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's the most specialized cell to handle anything, right? It's like the jack of all trades, master of none. Whereas on the other side, we have a slower yet very, very, very specific immune response, and we call this the adaptive immune response. This is primarily where our lymphocytes take a lot of control, and this is where things like antibodies, our T cells, our natural killer cells, the actual lymphocytes really reign supreme, because those guys are very specific to only one antigen. So if that antigen gets in there and it's found by one of the lymphocytes that can only trigger on that antigen, it's going to have to undergo a process of activation, multiplication, etc. And if it's a B cell, it's also going to undergo essentially antibody synthesis and create tons and tons of antibodies. And this is why it takes a little bit longer, because we really only start out with a couple of each of these cells that respond to specific antigen. And that's why it takes longer. The cells kind of have to build up their response. Whereas our rapid portion of this non-specific immune response is going to be very generic. And in some cases, it's more than enough, right? Sometimes it's not even needed to handle whatever pathogen or pseudo-infectious type antigen that there is. So, we probably have seen this picture before. This is the differentiation pathway of our hematopoietic stem cells. As you can see, very early on in the process, we have a split between lymphoids and myeloids. Myeloid cells are kind of everything we've talked about, plus our new white blood cells that we'll be mentioning now. So myeloids, as we've already seen before, they're going to give us our megakaryocytes, which, remember, they split and become platelets, our erythrocytes, red blood cells, and then they give us our leukocytes, our white blood cells. And white blood cells can be generically further divided into basophils, neutrophils, eosinophils, and monocytes. Monocytes and macrophages can kind of be thought of as the same thing. They function slightly differently and have slightly different roles, but macrophages are really the big guys when we talk about dealing with infection. They're the big eaters, which is why they have literally a name that means big eater. Basophils, neutrophils, and eosinophils, those are called granulocytes. And if you look at the picture, you'll notice that they have all these little dots in there, and that's supposed to represent these little granules. And these granules, they actually can do two things with them. They can secrete the granules, or they can phagocytize whatever needs to be destroyed and kind of combine that with the granules. And these granules are filled with stuff, with chemical agents that are basically designed to break down biological tissue. So these guys can be very nasty, and it's part of why the concept of why they're so generic, right? You know, especially the neutrophil. It's going to be our most common white blood cell, and in fact, it's anywhere from for a complete blood count with differential, you'll see a normal neutrophil level being about 50 to 55%, but it can go as high as 65% and still be considered normal in a white blood count. So the other guys, a lot less common though, are lymphocytes that we haven't really talked about yet. Those guys will make up, about 20-25% of all white blood cells. Our basophils, realistically, sometimes you'll do a complete blood count. You'll take a sample of the blood, you'll put it under the microscope, you won't even see one. They're very rare. They typically make up less than 1% of all white blood cells. And then eosinophils, those guys kind of hang out. They do some cool stuff that's not even necessarily related to the immune system, but they're our primary responders to parasitic infection. And that leads me back to neutrophils. Neutrophils are a primary response to bacterial infection. And lymphocytes, they're our primary responders to viral infections, right? So if you look at a complete blood count with differential, there can be a bacterial, parasitic, and viral infection that all has the same presenting signs and symptoms. Without even needing to do a culture, you can get a very good idea of what category of pathogen it's going to be, which gives you a great idea on what medication to start therapy with, right? So an antibiotic or an antiparasitic or an antiviral, okay? So that's why this kind of idea is important. So on the other side, we have lymphocytes. There are the NK cells, which are natural killers. They're granular lymphocytes. These guys are very special in that they're actually our body's primary defense against our own cells that have kind of gone rogue or haywire. They're really our only way to defend ourselves against something like cancer. The other two, the T cells and the B cells, they kind of work together. Our B cells, they make antibodies, and our T lymphocytes can be thought of as two different things because, well, there's three real subclassifications of T lymphocytes. We have our cytotoxic T cells, which is what everyone always thinks of with T cells. They're the ones that do exactly what their name says. They're cytotoxic. They're toxic to pathogens. They attack pathogens directly. Then we have T helper cells. These guys kind of help coordinate all of the other cells. They play a big role in secreting a lot of these cellular communication factors that when we talk about immune functions and whatnot, we call them cytokines. And then we have a much smaller number of something called T regulatory cells, and T regulatory cells kind of help shut the immune response down. And there is some evidence that certain autoimmune conditions are related to an issue in the number of T regulatory cells, because if we don't have enough of those, we can't fully control our immune response, right? Our immune response can run out of control, and that's not good. So all of our white blood cells can be differentiated from each other by certain protein markers. These are called CD markers. We're not going to go into detail on that. Each of them has a very specific CD marker, several different CD markers, in fact, which is how you can kind of tell the subtypes apart from each other. and how you can tell if there's an issue with certain lymphocytes. There are hundreds of different CD markers, and they play all kinds of different roles, and they're not super specific to immune cells. Other cells have CD markers, but it's a way that we can analyze cells and determine, what actual type of cell something is. So that's important to keep in mind. Like T cells, the two main types we talked about before, the cytotoxic and the T helper cells, for instance, the cytotoxic cells are CD8 positive, whereas the T helper cells are going to be CD4 positive. Okay, so again, you don't need to know that detail. That's just a great example. So, as hematopoiesis occurs, we get our lymphoid stem cell. Our lymphoid stem cell will then differentiate into either the natural killer lineage or the standard lymphocyte lineage. As we follow our standard lymphocyte lineage, it will differentiate again based on signaling factors and turn into a B cell or a T cell. At this point, it is very, very, very immature, right? It hasn't learned how to be an immune cell yet. And in order for that to happen, it kind of needs to be isolated from any potential antigen, right? Our body actually kind of, in a way, trains these cells. And B cells and T cells are aptly named because of where they do this maturation process and how they learn how to be an immune cell. Our B cells are named aptly because they mature in the bone marrow. And our T cells, they migrate to the thymus, which, if you remember, the thymus sits in the anterior, slightly superior aspect, just in front of and above the heart in the mediastinum. And that's where they mature. Our thymus is a really interesting gland because it's actually the largest it is pretty much very early in childhood. It actually atrophies as you age. And in fact, in a lot of older people, it's pretty much indistinguishable tissue if you do a autopsy or dissection and look for one. Unless, of course, they have an issue like a thymoma, which is a tumor of the thymus gland. So, as we talked about before, B cells are all about antibodies. And antibodies are these little protein molecules that they secrete that are supposed to bind to an antigen. And an antigen is any sort of item that an antibody wants to bind to. Anything is really an antigen, right? But all of the antigen for the antibody is highly, highly specialized. It's very, very specific. The antibody can essentially only bind one chemical structure ever. And B cells only ever make one type of antibody they only make an antibody for that very specific antigen, okay? Now, there are 5 different types of antibodies. They all have slightly different structures and can do slightly different things, but we won't spend much time on that. As we talked about already, again, the T cell is primarily, depending on what subtype it is, it's either going to directly attack the issue, the antigen, or it's going to help regulate and control the immune response. So we've kind of already talked about the bone marrow and thymus, so we'll keep going. One thing I do want to talk about is the concept of primary versus secondary lymph organs. The primary lymph organs are where the lymph cells, so the T, B cells, where they mature. That's only the thymus and the bone marrow. All other lymphatic structures are considered secondary. And that includes the spleen, even though the spleen is considered the largest lymphoid tissue in the body. And when we look at our spleen, we can really see the differentiation between its purpose of, quote unquote, filtering the blood and separating, breaking down red blood cells that are old and dying, and then sending the hemoglobin over to the liver for processing. It has what's called a red pulp and a white pulp. The red pulp is highly vascular and functions for that filtration purpose to help break down the red blood cells. But we also have a white pulp. And this white pulp exists because tons of B cells, especially B cells, hang out in the spleen. They hang out in such a large number in the spleen that they're under examination. The spleen actually has components that are white. And they do this to help catch pathogens. It's a great place for them to be able to do that, since the spleen is a blood filtering organ. This is also part of the reason why certain infections like mononucleosis caused by the Epstein-Barr virus, why you will see viral infections leading to splenomegaly, so an enlargement of the spleen. And that's why people with viral infections sometimes have to be very careful with accidents and falls if that happens while they have splenomegaly, because you can easily rupture your spleen at that point if it's nice and inflated, essentially. So moving on, something that a lot of people may or may not know, I find it's about a 50-50 split. Everyone knows about tonsils and adenoids, and a lot of people know about them because people get them removed, especially as kids. Well, guess what? Those are basically lymph nodes. They're lymph tissue, and it's very common for kids to have recurrent infections, especially related to areas around the mouth. Because, kids absolutely love to put things into their mouth as they're developing their sensory experience of the world, essentially, finding out what's food, what's not food. Kids don't necessarily know these things, and that happens the first 5-7 years of life. So it's not uncommon for kids to have recurrent infections in this area. And it can even involve the ear, because the eustachian tube, which drains into the nasopharynx and the oropharynx, it can stagnate, because as the child grows and develops, the eustachian tube will actually move from a very horizontal position, which is beneficial for, especially bacterial growth, to a more vertical position that actually truly allows drainage as they become closer to being an adult. So all of this stuff kind of leads to this area. And that's why we have so many lymphatic tissues readily accessible from the mouth. So, moving on to immunity. As we talked about before, we kind of have multiple ways to talk about immunity. We have innate versus adaptive, and we have barrier tissues. So remember, barrier tissues are exactly like their name. They're like a wall. They're a barrier. We have our innate response, which is very rapid. It's very generic, not always fully effective, but it's designed to try to get the job done as the adaptive immune system really ramps up. And the adaptive immune system, it can take 7 to 10 days for the adaptive immune system to really get into the swing of things. And our adaptive immune system, as the name implies, it's highly specific to whatever pathogen is present. And it's primarily, again, driven by those lymphocytes, because our lymphocytes are so highly specialized. So what you're going to see here is examples of innate barrier defense and various other stuff. We're not going to spend too much time on that here. So here's the idea of inflammation. Inflammation, everyone's always heard about it, but a lot of people don't quite fully appreciate the importance of it. Everyone always says, oh, you did this, go take a anti-inflammatory. But that's not always the best option, because inflammation is really a crucial part of healing, okay? And it's something that happens from injury. It's something that happens due to infection, because in reality, infection causes injury. Bacteria don't just go into our body to, have a symbiotic relationship with us. They're going there and they're proliferating in order to, find their own resources. They're destroying cells in order to gain more resources so that they can continue to proliferate and grow. And a key regulator in inflammation is a cell called a mast cell. Mast cell is known for the secretion of histamine. It's also highly associated with IgE, which is a type of antibody that's associated with allergic reactions. IgE will bind the mast cell and causes the mast cell to release histamine, which, as you know, if you have something like seasonal allergies, what medications do you take? An antihistamine. That is one of the ways to reduce certain types of inflammation. So really, our inflammatory response has 4 steps. There is a tissue injury. So whatever causes the tissue injury, there's going to be a lot of things that happen here, but essentially we get a release of substances like histamine, leukotrienes, and prostaglandins. This gives us our inflammation, it gives us our pain, and most importantly, it leads to our next step, which is vasodilation. It's going to increase blood flow and allow more cells to come to the area to either begin fighting the pathogen, if the pathogen is the cause of the injury, or to start bringing more nutrients and rebuilding the damaged tissue. Then we have increased vascular permeability. This basically means that our blood vessels are going to allow cells to cross through it very easily. This is a process that's called extravasation. So extravasation is basically the process of white blood cells leaving the blood vessel in a spot that it normally can't leave. And then recruitment of phagocytes, which basically is the big first step to repair. So same concept applies to if your part of a building collapses. What's the first thing they have to do to repair it? They have to remove the collapsed structure and anything else that is damaged from that. And that's what happens first. And the concept here, as you may have seen, is very similar to how we talked about something like clotting, right? We have these signaling factors. We get something to come in and help slow the damage. We then get stuff to come in to help fix the damage. So, adaptive immune response. One thing that we have not mentioned at this point is something called MHC. MHC stands for Major Histocompatibility Complex. There are 2 types. There is MHC1 and MHC2. And these are key for the cell's ability to recognize antigen. All right. The B cell is typically associated with MHC1, whereas T cells are associated with MHC2. MHC1 is important for kind of saying that, hey, I'm part of you, don't attack me. Whereas MHC2 is important because it allows antigen presenting cells to give an antigen to a T cell. It kind of puts it on the MHC2 on its cell surface, and as you can see in this picture here, it gives it to the T cell, right? It's activating the T cell by doing that. So we have kind of a split division of our adaptive immune response. The B cells will lead what's called the humoral immunity response. And this is because antibodies will be made and then they get secreted into the circulatory system. B cells can function on their own because of this. B cells actually will have the ability to both secrete antibodies as well as essentially have an antibody sitting on its cell surface. So it can not only directly bind antigen, but its antibodies can go out and bind antigen. And the cool thing about antibodies is the prototypical shape is this Y configuration, meaning that at minimum, an antibody can actually bind 2 different pieces of antigen, right? So if, for instance, the B cell makes an antibody that can bind, let's say, the cell wall of bacteria, an antibody can actually then bind 2 separate bacteria at the same time and hold them together. And it gets even crazier when we think about there's more antibody. So we can see these masses that get formed of bacteria that get trapped because they're bound and stuck together to other bacteria, and they're stuck together by all these different antibodies. And this is something that's called a immune complex. And immune complexes actually play a major role in some disorders, to include something like post-streptococcal glomerulonephritis, where the immune complex will actually get stuck in the nephron of the kidney. And as you may or may not know, the nephron is the filtering apparatus of the kidney. It's how we filter and create urine. It's also important in autoimmune conditions like rheumatoid arthritis and systemic lupus erythematosus, where immune complexes will get deposited in and around joint surfaces, and that causes inflammation, and inflammation is not good for cartilage, as we have talked about before. So, the idea of active versus passive immunity. This is kind of another way to think about how we acquire immunity to something. Active immunity is exactly as it's stated. There's an active role played in developing the immunity. So if I'm going to develop active immunity to something, it is going to be a kind of, I've been exposed to a pathogen and my body is actively responding to it, right? Or I have taken a vaccine and I am now actively developing antibodies for whatever substance that vaccine gave me. On a side note here, there actually is a typo in the lecture. Vaccines can be both killed or attenuated. Okay, so they can essentially be attenuated or fully inactivated. A lot of the vaccines we use in modern day, they are inactivated, and a lot of them aren't even a full virus. Without going even more off the rails, viruses are a really weird pseudo-living type thing. They're not quite alive, but they're definitely not dead because they're made up of the DNA or RNA. And so they fit this weird role, but they primarily have 3 components to them. They're going to have their own DNA or RNA, their own genetic material. They're going to have a capsule, and they have what's called a spike protein. And the spike protein is how the virus actually gets into our body, because the spike protein, it's kind of like a Trojan horse. It tricks the body into opening the cell membrane up. It binds to a receptor on the cell membrane, and in goes the virus. And the virus will then hijack the cell to start replicating itself, because again, it can't replicate itself, so it's technically not alive. It's like this weird mix between like a living organism, a non-living organism, a parasite. They're really funky and really interesting. But anyway, active immunity is from active exposure and the active process of your body developing its own antibodies. Passive immunity, on the other hand, is something that is incredibly important for infants and newborns. You acquire a lot of immunity from the infant. Acquires a lot of immunity from its mother via breastfeeding. The antibody category IgG readily travels through breast milk and is pretty much the only initial defense against infection that a newborn has. IgG goes through the placenta and IgA goes through the milk. IgA is associated with ducts, so it's going to go through the mammillary glands during breastfeeding. Another form of passive immunity would be something like a antibody transfusion. As we saw before, the COVID vaccine and the antivirals that were more specific towards COVID were deemed safe and placed on the market and shown to be pretty effective. One thing that we were relying on for very sick people was actually transfusions of plasma from previously infected individuals who had antibodies for the COVID virus. We were transplanting those antibodies via transfusion into people that were either immunocompetent, so their immune system couldn't make it, or people who just weren't doing really well in fighting the infection. So, moving on to some diseases. So there's kind of two ways to think about the immune system. We have diseases that are autoimmune, which means our immune system kind of ramps itself up for no reason and is triggered on stuff that it should not be triggered on. On the other hand, we have certain disorders that cause immunocompromise, which means our immune system has been kind of shut off. It's shut down. It's not as effective. One of the big disorders for that is an HIV infection. The HIV virus absolutely loves to find T cells. And as you remember, T cells play a major role in both cytotoxic actions, but also in coordinating the immune response. And it absolutely loves to destroy T cells. So we lose a big, important portion of the immune system. And that actually causes people with HIV and AIDS to be super susceptible to opportunistic infections, which are things that don't normally infect normal, healthy, immunocompetent people. This will be, very basic stuff like Candida albicans infection. That's the prototypical yeast infection. A lot of things like funguses and yeasts are not very effective at getting through our barrier tissues. But, it's very possible if you're immunocompromised to end up with those infections. There's also another way we can think about immunocompromised individuals is that it can be an iatrogenic reason. So in fact, one of the ways that we treat autoimmune diseases is we use immune suppressing medications. So these can be things like methotrexate, which formerly was primarily used for cancer, but they use it a lot now in conditions like lupus, like RA, and even the basic corticosteroids. Corticosteroids, which mimic the hormones released by our adrenal glands, they are immunosuppressant, and they're one of the first-line drugs for any autoimmune condition. So it's kind of a risk-benefits analysis there, right? A lot of people that are on these drugs are okay. They are a little more susceptible to infection, but they do still have a good immune response. On the other hand, we have ways to fully destroy the immune system. So when somebody has like a cancer, like lymphoma, or if they need a organ transplant, we have to actually destroy the immune system because, with lymphoma, the cancer is of the immune system. And for transplanted organs, in order to prevent organ rejection, we have to match so many different factors, and even then, there's still a chance. So to really make sure that the transplanted organ is perfectly fine, we essentially kill the immune system. Okay, so that is the end of our lymphatic and immune system discussion. We're now getting into the second half for the week, and we're talking about the digestive system. Everyone knows what our digestive system. It's really a long, continuous tube from our mouth out of our anus at the end, right? And its whole function is all about absorbing macro and micro molecules into the body and ensuring that we have all of the resources necessary for our body to function and our cells to proliferate, live, etc. So, as you'll see on this diagram, the digestive system really begins with our mouth. Our mouth plays a major role in the mechanical digestion of food. We often think about digestion being this chemical process, but the mouth plays a major mechanical role. And this is because of the idea of surface area of food. So if you put a item in, if you eat an item, it's going to be this mass. Whatever the mass was, that is the size that you bit, it's more efficient to chew that up into a bunch of smaller pieces, right? Because once it hits the stomach and starts, even in the mouth with saliva, it starts to undergo chemical digestion, and it's going to have greater surface area when it's broken up into smaller bits, which means digestion is more efficient. We have one way to kind of divide our digestive system into kind of primary and secondary organs. The primary organs are the ones that are going to directly come in contact with food that needs digesting. And our secondary organs are going to be those like the gallbladder, the liver, the pancreas that secrete chemicals into the digestive tract in order to aid in digestion. A sub-area of our digestive tract that you'll commonly hear talked about is the alimentary canal, and this is kind of the idea that our digestive system is this tube. It's that 25-foot long tube, minimum of 25-foot long tube that goes pretty much from the esophagus all the way out the back end of your body. And as I mentioned already, there are accessory structures like our pancreas, saliva glands, teeth, etc. Not teeth, but anything that doesn't directly come in contact with food is considered accessory to the alimentary canal. So our alimentary canal, as most tubular organs, is going to have a multi-layer system. The most inner layer is going to be a mucosal layer, which is great because mucosa actually functions to do a lot of different things. But it's going to be a barrier tissue, as we talked about. It's going to help with the immune response. It's going to also be able to fold very easily, which allows, again, another way to increase surface area of digestion, which allows more efficient uptake of food. And then following that, we have underneath, is a submucosal layer. And this is kind of where a lot of connective tissue lies, and it's where the blood and lymphatic vessels kind of hang out. Because remember, as we absorb things into our digestive system, we have to get it where it needs to be. We have to deliver nutrients. We have to deliver all of these, vitamins, minerals, wherever it needs to go in the body. And so we need readily available access to the circulation systems of the body. And we need the lymphatic system there, not only because it will help circulate, but because bacteria absolutely love hanging out in our digestive tract. And in fact, there are a lot of resources out there that tell us there are more bacteria in our digestive tract than our entire body has a number of cells, which is a wild thing to think about. We have more bacteria inside of just our digestive tract than our body has number of cells. Following the submucosal layer, we have the muscular layer, the muscularis, which is, as we should know by this point, smooth muscle walls. These smooth muscles kind of help a little bit in mechanical aspects of digestion, but they also push along the chyme, as it's called, further into the tract for further digestion. So I'm not going to go too much in depth here on the digestive tract. We've already talked about the mouth being a major component of mechanical digestion, but it houses the salivary glands, which are important for breaking down carbohydrates. We have the pharynx, which really is part of the throat. It can be thought of kind of just as a tube to help move the food along further in. The esophagus is a muscular tube that connects the pharynx to the stomach. Our stomach does a lot of different things, but it's primarily known for its high concentration of acid, which is very good at breaking down a lot of different things, especially protein. And chyme is formed essentially here. It's like the mass of digestible food, and it gets propelled into the duodenum, which is the first component of the small intestine. And our small intestine is made up of 3 different pieces: the duodenum, the jejunum, and the ileum. Each of them have very minor differences histologically, and that is partially because they have different roles in absorbing slightly different things. Then accessory organs. The liver, for instance, makes bile. The gallbladder stores bile, and bile is important for the digestion of fats. The pancreas does 2 things. It creates more digestive enzymes, and it also secretes bicarbonate, which is very important because the pancreatic duct dumps into the duodenum right after the stomach. So as the chyme comes out of the stomach through the pyloric sphincter, there's going to be acid that comes along with it. And pretty much everything past the duodenum does not want that acid. It can't stand being exposed to acid. So to combat this, the pancreas secretes bicarbonate, and bicarbonate reduces the pH. Okay, so the acid's already done its job, so we need to increase the pH back to a more tolerable level for the rest of the digestive system, which is why bicarbonate is released at this point. And then our large intestine plays a major role in water and electrolyte absorption. So this next process, we're going to really skip through. It's pretty straightforward. It's just the various processes of digestion, as well as a little bit of details about certain parts of some of these organs. One thing to talk about with the large intestine, you'll commonly see it referred to as the colon. It has several different components. So everything starts at a point called the cecum. The ileum, which is the last component of the small intestine, joins up with the large intestine at the cecum. There's actually a valve there. It's called the ileocecal valve. Lovely name. Anatomy often has names that make a lot of sense. Attached to the cecum is the lovely appendix that everyone knows about. We don't quite understand the role of the appendix. There's some theory that it's an immune function. It has immune function because there's often so many white blood cells found related to it. But we won't spend much time on it because it's ultimately not that important. If an organ can be removed from your body without any problems, it's not that important. And the appendix is one of those. Then we have our ascending colon, which goes from the cecum upwards towards the hepatic flexure, named, or the right colic flexure. It's aptly named because it's on the right side and it's next to the liver. We have our transverse colon that runs all the way across till we hit the left colic flexure, also known as the splenic flexure. Again, aptly named, left side of the body next to the spleen. We have the descending colon, which goes down until it makes a kind of abrupt turn along the abdominal wall, and that's the sigmoid colon. It's sigmoid because it's sort of S-shaped. And then that kind of turns into the rectum, which contains the anal canal and is the end of the digestive tract. You can see here the long list of different enzymes that we have. There are several different types of various items. Some of the ones that are really important to know, though, is salivary amylase, which is important for carbohydrate, especially complex polysaccharide digestion. Lipase, secreted to break down fats. Pepsin is important for proteins. Lactase and maltase are for their respective proteins, or their respective sugars, which are lactose and maltose. Maltose is literally just two glucose molecules combined together, whereas lactose is a glucose molecule combined with a galactose molecule. And one interesting thing about lactase is that about 2/3 of all people in the world are lactose intolerant, meaning they either don't produce lactase or they don't produce enough lactase to readily handle food that primarily has lactose sugars. It's a very interesting thing to think about, and there has been some literature that links early exposure to lactose, especially as an infant and young child, to the development of conditions like irritable bowel syndrome and ulcerative colitis, Crohn's disease, those types of things. So it's very interesting to think about. So there's all kinds of those guys there. Now, moving on to nutrition. The current USDA methodology for determining nutrition is what they call MyPlate. The idea is you kind of can look at a plate and you should be able to proportion to about what's shown on the screen here with the MyPlate. Caloric intake. So the idea of a calorie is actually a measure of the amount of energy required to raise 1,000 grams of water by 1 degree Celsius. This is not all that important for our sake, but that just reminds you of the idea that a calorie is really a unit of energy, and it's an easy way for us to quantify how our body uses it. The average person will only need between 1,500 and 2,000 calories per day, but things like body mass, especially lean body mass, so muscle, and physical activity of any kind, whether it's manual labor job, or if you're sitting at a desk all day long, those things heavily influence the amount of calories you need to eat. There is about 3,500 calories in 1 pound of body weight. So for an individual to gain 1 pound, they have to consume 3,500 calories above the absolute minimum necessary to sustain their activity level. This basically tells us that if you're eating 200 calories per day over what is absolutely needed, you can gain 1 pound every 18 days. And that's actually very easy to do with modern diet, unfortunately. Another thing to consider is the idea of the thermogenic effect of food. So this is basically the idea that eating food, while it gives us energy, it requires energy to digest food. Because remember, there's all these enzymes that need made. There's all these other things that happen to digest. So protein is the highest required energy that has to be put in for breaking it down. Okay. Following that is going to be fat, and then carbohydrates, which are realistically the absolute easiest for our body to break down, which makes a lot of sense because our body primarily fuels itself from glucose. Another thing we're going to talk about, vitamins. 2 main classifications of vitamins are fat-soluble and water-soluble. The fat-soluble vitamins are A, D, E, and K. Vitamin A is associated with the retinol proteins, very important for vision, but they also play other roles. Vitamin D, as we talked about previously, is very important for our body's ability to process and absorb calcium, but vitamin D is this if we talk about a vitamin, it's very powerful for a vitamin. It's incredibly important in the production of cholesterol and anything that really goes through the HMG-CoA pathway. So, any of our body's steroid hormones, any of our body's sex hormones, vitamin D is very important. Vitamin K, which is rather interesting, we get a lot of our vitamin K from a symbiotic relationship with bacteria in our gut. So one other interesting thing about fat-soluble vitamins for people that have been severely overweight and they lose a lot of weight, they can actually have hypervitaminosis as a result of the breakdown of that fat, because again, these vitamins will get stored in fat. Whereas water-soluble vitamins, which are primarily our B vitamins, vitamin C, and a couple others, we actually will excrete them via urine if the body has too much, which is why it is rather silly to see, vitamin C supplements that have, 500 to 1,000% of the necessary vitamin C for your daily intake. Your body's just going to get rid of it. So, as you can see here, there are various different functions and sources for all of these things. I would take a look at that. I'm not going to go through a lot of them. Some interesting things with B vitamins, especially vitamin B1, B2, B3, and then B9 and B12. Deficiencies in those guys are all linked to nervous system damage. Vitamin B12 is vitamin B12 deficiency is directly related to anemia, and is actually typically a autoimmune process that we call pernicious anemia. Minerals, on the other hand, we've talked a lot about minerals to this point. Some of them are classified as salts, some aren't, but you'll have seen all of these guys over and over again. Potassium, sodium, calcium, chloride, all of those are readily important for membrane charge differentials when we're talking about muscle contraction, action potentials, etc. Phosphorus, calcium, those guys are very important for our bones. They're very important for, especially calcium plays a ton of roles. And then magnesium is very important for so many different functions, and it's often overlooked because it is pretty hard to be magnesium deficient. There are trace minerals as well. Some of these we have talked about, like iron being important for the production of hemoglobin, which, remember, is the substance in red blood cells that binds oxygen and carbon dioxide. Iodine, important for the production of thyroid hormone. And a lot of these other guys, they're all over the place, but they're called trace minerals for a reason. So they're necessary in small amounts, and our body typically cannot create them. So that is everything for this week. If you have any questions, please ask.